1492. Remember that. More cultural and linguistic diversity here. So I guess that's about all I wanted to say. And thank you for having me.
She's really smart, isn't she? So, good morning, all my relatives, and again to Mr. Castaneda from, our old people, our ancestors, the unborn ones, to yours also that way, and thanking you for letting us be here and talk in this way, and the prayer that you did, because this elder that I work with, this medicine man, he teaches that the two most sacred creations that the Creator created were life and death. And that's what we're talking about here today, is life and death. So we're in a very center of a very sacred point in this the dream of God. And I want to start by doing a serious thing and then a kind of a little funny thing here. And one of the sayings that has really helped me out through the time that I've been doing the work that I've been doing in Indian country is saying that our relatives from across the ocean, the Kalahari Bushmen, say there's always a dream dreaming us. And I really believe that very strongly, that right now this is part of the Creator's dream as we're here gathered and talking about healing and life and death and God, the devil. It's all right here, and like this old man says, it's right here, all of it, the good, the bad, the genocide, the life. He says, you activate whichever one you want, but it's all right there, and it doesn't do anything by itself. You activate it. And as I was sitting here listening to people talk about civilization and Western this and Western that, I remembered that one time somebody asked Gandhi, they says, well, what do you think of Western civilization? And he says, well, I think they should try it. So I think that's, this little guy wearing a diaper, and he says neat stuff like that. And so I just wanted to kind of reiterate that. And so, yeah, and also in the work that I've done, going from psychological principles to changing the metaphor completely to something that means something to us in our heart, that's also been the crux of the work that I've done. And I was fortunate enough that while I was going through graduate school, at the same time I was getting a parallel training. It was by a California Indian person from up north. His name was Clarence, and I didn't know it at the time, but he was also giving me a doctorate degree during that time, and he was paralyzed from the neck down, and for 3 years I would go to see him. He would laugh at me a lot, and in between this laughter he told me a few things during those 3 years, and it's what he told me that became the crux of the work that I do, the stuff that I write, and the models that I supposedly develop, although these models are at least 10,000 years old. But when I put them down on paper and publish them in journals, and people think, well, gosh, that guy really knows stuff. I don't know anything. I just kind of reiterating what's as old as the hills, and I think someone said that, right? There's nothing new under the sun. One of our relatives from across the water that way. And so, when I was starting to do my work there in Central California, where a lot of the genocide had a tremendous impact, and actually till very recently, the events that Bonnie was talking about the being able to get paid for proving that you had killed an Indian person was up into the 1900s. And there was grandfathers and great-grandfathers and grandmothers from that area who had been there, who had actually seen this happening. And so here I am as an intern trying to start providing some of the healing services for this community. Of course, one of the first things that you have to do when you start doing this is you've got to go around and ask a lot of stupid questions in the form of a needs assessment, which of course a lot of these old people were saying, well, we already know what our needs are. Didn't your grandmother teach you any manners? I mean, you should know what's going on here. And one of the things that kept coming up over and over in conversations with these folks is the problem, the way that they were describing it was not the alcohol, not the suicide, not the drugs, not any of that stuff. They said, well, the problem here is that we have a wounded soul. And of course, there's no construct in psychology to look that up and try to discover what that means. So, you can go to your whichever psych text. Not only is there no wounded soul, there's no soul at all. Even though the very word psychology is supposed to mean the study of soul. But I've yet to meet a psychologist who even acknowledges in having a soul, for one, and then they get very irate when I remind them that this is really the task at hand here. And the treatment of psychopathology is the treatment of soul suffering. And if you're a psychotherapist, then you're a soul healer, literally translated. And very few of my brothers and sisters in the profession acknowledge any of that. So the soul wound is what we're talking about here. The whole thing that Russell talks about in his book. It talks about the systematic eradication of not just the physical beings, but it went deeper than that. I really believe that, and somebody used the word demonic earlier on, that this spirit, this force of genocide, wants to get rid of even more. It wants to actually do away with the physical being, but it also wants to do with the essence of what people perceived Indian people to be. And we can see this historically after the military campaigns were not able to terminate or assimilate all Indian people, because that was the policy up until very recently, and still policy would fantasize that Indian people assimilate and just become middle class, good Christian folks, and just forget about being heathen savages. And one of the the military campaigns, and the other campaign was the land itself. And again, when we start looking at psychological healing, is that when we have a loss, like when we lose a relative to death, there's usually a grieving period where we can go and get healed from the loss of that relative. And so that was not allowed to happen, because one massacre would happen, and before you could even bury the dead, here would come another one. So there was a lot of wounding, a lot of trauma, if you will, that did not have the time to resolve. And so what we found out here recently, as scholars, psychologists who have been studying the Jewish Holocaust, have empirically shown that if that trauma is not resolved, it's passed on to the next generation. And this is, they've crunched the numbers and done all that. When we first started talking about this in Indian country, people thought, man, those Indians are really losing it now. Now they want, to say this stuff. And the medicine people I was talking to were completely aware of this, because the clients that I was seeing were starting to say things like, I feel like my great-grandfather, my great-grandmother are here with me right now. And when I went to them, they said, well, that's because they are. And I'm like, again, there's no construct in Western psychology to understand that. As well as I was sitting here, I had the distinct feeling that those relatives are right here, right now, watching us. They are here. The Chumash people, all of the people that have passed through, this sacred land for many generations, are here in this conference with us right now, and seeing what we're saying. The great-grandfathers, great-grandmothers of everyone who's here are saying, well, my relatives, my great-great-grandchildren finally are getting together to do something good here and to talk about this, because this is the only place we can heal this. If they could heal it for us in the spirit world, they would do it. But for some reasons, the rules are, and I'm not a theological genius or anything like that, but my understanding is that the rules are that we have to do it here. That's where we're put on this plane, so that we can take care of the wounding that happened in previous generations. And not only is it passed down, what we're finding out is it's also cumulative. So if you're a Native American born today to people who have been genocided, you already are carrying 4 or 5 generations of trauma, and you haven't even barely taken a few breaths. And that's how deep this wounding goes. Actually, one time I was working in Central California, a woman came to me, an old woman, as a client, and she happened to be the last woman in her tribe. And she's coming to me for therapy, right? And I distinctly remember one dream that she had, because most of the work that I do through the use of being in the dream time. And that's the only thing that has been useful to try to understand a little bit of what's going on here. And in this one dream, she recounted that she was also a basket maker. And for those of you who know something about the culture of California Indians, this is a very sacred task. The basket maker is the keeper of the story, keeper of the tradition. And she saw a mound of baskets, and they were on fire, and she was trying to rescue them. And again, you don't need to be a Freudian or Jungian genius to know what was going on with this elder's psyche. And that's basically what, over the last few years, we've been doing, is to retracting and extracting out of the fire, what's left of the culture. And of course, the spirit can never be destroyed, but it can be really thwarted. And that's also the other thing that is the task of our communities. There is a duality in everything, like I started talking earlier, and I don't want to end up very pessimistic here, because I really don't believe that way. I used to be very pessimistic when I started doing this work, because it seemed very hopeless. But again, this medicine man, the way he sees what happened is that he says, what happened here is that there's a wounding that occurred to our people. So he says that the price has already been paid. So he says what's going to happen is there's going to be a lot of really wonderful things happening to Indian people once we wake up, because already the blood sacrifice has been done. And I think in all of our cultures, the one thing that our mom here, the earth, expects in order for her to continue giving to us and producing us even, is the whole idea of blood sacrifice, is that there has to be blood put on the earth, and then there's the re-emergence, the emergence of us, and also of our spirituality. And so we've paid the price, and that is a great mystery, and we don't even pretend to understand what that's all about. But also, within that wounding that we have, all we have to do is turn around the scarring, and within the wounding itself, the medicine is also present. And we have to believe that. And that's why I think that a lot of the archetypes of the healer, going back to Asclepius and some of those stories, is that the greatest healers are the ones who have been greatly wounded. And when we talk about soul healing, especially even in modern day psychology, psychiatry, it seems like the ones who do the best work are the ones who themselves have been really scarred, and they're the ones that produce the greatest healing. One of the other woundings that occurred, and like when Bonnie was talking, I'm more into conspiracy. I don't think that the diseases and all of that, and historically it shows, it was no accident that smallpox devastated Indian people. When the United States Army, or even before that, when the Spaniards were coming to the southwest, or the French going into the plains area, that they would give a smallpox infested blanket to a member of that community, and then allow that member loose in the community. To me, that's not a bad germ that is looking to kill Indians. That is by design, that somebody says this is a way that we can exterminate this whole group of people and still continue being good Christian folks, because we're not shooting anybody. And so that's part of the plan. And one of the most diabolical plans happened around the early 1900s, because after all the military attempts at extermination, disease extermination, Indian people still persisted on being Indians. In the truest, although Indian is a colonial label, and being the people that we were, we persisted in being the way we were. And somewhere in Washington, D.C., several guys got together and said, well, there's one way that we can finally put an end to this Indian business. And the way that we're going to do this is destroy the family system. And this is very socially acceptable because we're not going to take Custer out there and slaughter Indians because, right now people are getting a little squeamish about that. But nobody's going to get squeamish if we take these children and put them in a school far, far away from their parents and take away their language, take away their way of prayer, take away everything that there is about them being Indian and make them forget that. And not only that, then the abuse, both physical, psychological, spiritual, and sexual abuse that happen in these boarding schools, we're reaping the harvest of that in present day clinics like the one that I work at. And in some tribes, these problems are just rampant. And what happens is that a lot of times our very own science, our very own healing brotherhoods and sisterhoods then say, well, the reason that your people are so messed up is who you are. It's because you're Indians, that's why you're so messed up. And so it's been my task for the last 17 years to tell these families the reason why they're so messed up. I mean, sure, there's responsibility for behavior, but also there's a responsibility from us healers to let them know that the reason there are so many problems is because somebody did something to you. And the equivalence of this would be to take a victim of rape and say, well, it's your fault that you're having all these symptoms and problems. I mean, if you weren't a bad person and didn't get raped, then you wouldn't be suffering like this. So that's the exact same thing that happened to Indian people. And the rape was at all levels. The rape of the earth, physical rape, spiritual rape, mythological rape. Because on a larger scale, a lot of the Indian tribes, and I guess I could safely say, were matriarchal in the mythology, to where of a close association with the earth, therefore the feminine ruled. And European mythology is very patriarchal. And so what happened when the patriarchy came here and imposed their will on this other type of mythology, that there was a complete raping of the whole hemisphere. And it is that's the wounding that a lot of the folks right here, just up the road from here in California, back in the early 80s when I first started doing this work, were referring to as the soul wound. And that wounding of the soul continues every time we do something to this land. The souls of Indian people suffer from that, because there is no differentiation between this one right here and this one right here. We are really part of it. Believe it or not, we really are part of the earth. And every fiber that is in this physical being is really just her. And that's one of the things that hopefully events like this, and hopefully that the energy of this persists, and keeps ongoing. And I'm sure that the commitment that I hear here today is going to be so. Oh. What? Oh no, she says my time's up. Yeah. And one of the things that is going to be very critical, and again referring to one of the medicine people, because very little of what I do, I didn't invent any of it. I usually talk to some of these folks who pray a lot, and then they tell me things. And he said that what needs to happen is that there has to be an acknowledgement of this. The United States government, the powers that be, at some point has to say something like, yeah, we did it, we're guilty. Just pretty much when you're working with incest victims and people like that, if the perpetrator does not come into the healing circle, that's completely up to them. But if they do, then they can make the healing complete for the whole family. And so far, the way I see that this is going is that us as Native people, we're healing. And we're doing it pretty much in spite of the perpetrator. And what we're doing here, in a way, is asking the perpetrator to say, if you want to, you can come sit in the circle with us, and you can heal yourself. Because one thing that a lot of perpetrators don't know is that there's a price for being a perpetrator. See, you can think that you're getting away with something, but usually the price is your own soul. And so the perpetrator can continue living without a soul and with completely disconnected from everything that is sacred, or else they can sit in this circle, in this sacred healing circle with us, and say, okay, we did this, forgive us. And knowing Indian people, they're praying, say, okay, I forgive you. You know, very giving, you know, we gave away the whole thing, you know, just for the asking. There was one incident, I forget if it was Chief Seattle or someone, when some of these real estate brokers early on were asking to buy the land, which is a completely absurd notion in those days. And he responded, well, do you want to buy some clouds also? I'll sell them all to you. You know, I mean, that's as much sense as that makes. And so part of the bridging that has to happen here is also the bridging of epistemologies, because there's no way that we can present this healing process to the native community. Whoa, was that synchronistic of something? See, it's one of the ancestors is saying, you're doing good, Ed, you know. So, hey. So, well, once the feminine has spoken. No, I lost my, what was I saying? Yes, there's no way that we can take this logical positivist way of thinking or believing or praying and expect, you know, to communicate with Indian folks. And one of the primest examples I can give you, all of you know who Joseph Campbell is, and at one point in one of his talks he said that he went to Japan and was talking to a Shinto priest. And of course, him being a scholar, asked the Shinto priest, well, could you tell me something about your theology, you know, your belief system? What do you do? And he says the Shinto priest, you know, kind of smiled a little bit, and he says, well, he says, we really don't have any theology. He says, we just dance. And so, you know, you have to dance. Hopefully we didn't take too much time.
You know what? We did really good. I want to thank Bonnie and Eduardo once again. Right now, we're going to have about a half hour of open discussion. If you have any questions that you'd like to address to Bonnie or Eduardo or anyone else, that'll be fine. You come up to the mic that Gary's going to fix right now. And our good friend Will Despalding has brought the grandmother's talking stick, which is hers, and she's allowed us to borrow it. So when you come up to use the mic, please take the talking stick from me and then pass it on to the person who comes next. So who would like to say something first? Yes. Oh, thank you. Yes. You come up to the mic.
Hello. It's good to be here. It's good to be here with you. Is the microphone working? You can hear me? I even have a speech, but now it doesn't seem like I want to give it. I do have a little business to conduct to tell you about some books that are over there, and I will do that, but or maybe I won't. Because Bonnie talked about alcoholism and Indians, I'm just reminded of a piece of Los Angeles history. Here in Los Angeles, starting when the U.S. started to take over here in the 1850s, we had a very, very nice system working here. public intoxication was against the law in Los Angeles for everybody, but you know, if you were white, somebody would probably take you home, but if you were an Indian, you would end up in jail. And there was a system then where if you wanted to, if you were white, you could come to the jail and buy somebody's labor for a week for about $1 or $2. And so on Monday, all the ranchers would come to the jail, and there'd be all these drunks, and they'd be kind of recovering, and the ranchers would take them home to their ranches and keep them there for the rest of the week. And this was good for the city because instead of spending $1 or $2 on money on food for these drunken people, mostly Indians, instead they were getting $1 or $2. And it was good for the ranchers because they had some very, very cheap labor, and it was good for the Indians because they could dry out. And then on Saturday, the ranchers would bring the Indians back into town, and they didn't have any obligation to pay them anything, but these ranchers were very, very generous people, and they usually did give those Indians a little gift, a bottle of booze. This was a wonderful system. I was reminded of two stories as I listened to the speakers. One of them is a Chinese story, and here in California, the native people all had stories that told how they came out of the earth here, but many of them also had stories about a journey from the north. So maybe this Chinese story is kind of appropriate. It doesn't have a name, but the first sentence of the story kind of serves as the name. It begins, a farmer had a horse, and one day the horse ran away. And the farmer's neighbor came to visit the farmer, and he said, "Oh, that's too bad. Your horse ran away." And the farmer said, "Well, I'm not really sure if it's good or if it's bad. We'll have to wait and see." And a few days later, the farmer's horse came back, and it had a female horse with it. And the farmer's neighbor came over and said, "Oh, that's really good. Your horse came back." And the farmer said, "Maybe it's good, maybe it's bad." And a few days later, the farmer's son was trying to train the new horse how to pull a plow, and the new horse reared up and came down on the farmer's son's leg and broke his leg. And the neighbor came over and he said, "Oh, that's really too bad. Your son's leg is broken." And the farmer said, "Maybe it's bad, and maybe it's good. I don't know." And a few days later, the army came through the area and took away all the sons except this farmer's son who had a broken leg. And the neighbor came over and said, "Oh, that's really good that your son's leg was broken and he didn't get taken away like my son." And the farmer said, "Well, maybe it's good and maybe it's bad." And this story has no ending. But I think it's a survivor's story. I think it helps me to survive, and I hope it'll help you to survive. And one last story that I have to tell before I go to the business part and tell you about these books is this story is from Science. And I just learned this a few days ago, but it connects to what Linda said about when you're cut off at the root, you die, and she was looking around and seeing America dying, and I've had that feeling many times. And this scientist studied a virgin forest in some parkland in, I think it was Wisconsin. They started this study 10 years ago, and they looked at this parkland, virgin forest that must be some of the best forest land in America, and they were shocked and dismayed to find out that 25% of this virgin forest was dead. 10 years ago, and their hearts sank. And they knew that 10 years later they were going to come back and study this land again. And they expected to find even more of the forest dead. They came back and they studied it, and 25% of the forest was dead.